Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, fellow delegates, ladies and gentlemen. The times we are living are very complex, and the common characteristics of the challenges of these times force us to think about things in a completely different way. The wound caused to the international framework founded on rules from the war of aggression of Russia on Ukraine is indeed having destabilizing effects well beyond the borders within which it is unfolding. And like a domino, it is contributing to reigniting or causing to explode other flashpoints of crisis. Democratic political systems are facing unprecedented dangers. Geoeconomic fragmentation is growing, bearing down consequences we must all deal with, especially the more fragile nations. The path toward a reduction in environmental emissions is at a crossroad in between ideological approaches and scarce solidarity, especially from the major emitters of greenhouse gases. The scarcity of water and energy have an ever deeper impact on development, on food security, and the social stability of entire communities. The instrumental use of religious faith has become a source of tensions, or worse, of persecution. There are hundreds of millions of people throughout the world that suffer due to their profession of faith. And at the top, as victims, there are Christians. We are witnessing the groundbreaking advent of generative artificial intelligence, a revolution that brings us to ask questions we could never imagine, although I'm not certain it is correct to call it intelligence, because the intelligent being is the one who asks the questions, not the one to give answers through data processing. Either way, it's a technology that, unlike all the innovations we've seen through the course of history, sets a blueprint for a world in which progress is no longer meant to optimize human capacities, but to replace them, with consequences that risk being dramatic, especially in the labor market, verticalizing and concentrating wealth even more. It is not by chance that Italy wanted this to be at the top of its agenda of its G7 presidency, because we want to do our part in defining a global governance for artificial intelligence capable of reconciling innovation, rights, labor, intellectual property, freedom of expression, democracy. This complexity, compounded by profoundly interconnected challenges, tells us first and foremost one thing: the problems of the global South are also the problems of the global North, and vice versa. There are no longer homogeneous blocks, and the interdependence of our destinies is a fact. For this reason, we are called to think differently from the past. The challenge is to make a firm paradigm shift in our relations among nations and in the functioning of multilateral organisms. The goal is to build a model of cooperation that is completely new. I personally believe that this new model can and must be based on a few, unfortunately not granted, principles, that is, mutual respect, fellowship, and concreteness. It means to have a rapport with one another on an equal footing, to recover that ability to listen to others, to understand their thinking, which is the basis for any form of mutual trust. Precisely because we believe in this approach, Italy set all of its events for its year holding the G7 presidency in an open format, with a very broad outreach involving all continents, the G20, the African Union, the financial and economic institutions, and the multilateral development banks. We have shown that the G7 is not an armored fortress that wants to fend off anyone, rather an offering of values open to the world. I think of the turning point Italy has reached in its relations with Africa. We have made operative at the bilateral level our investment plan for Africa, the MATE plan, with pilot projects in 9 African countries, creating strategic partnerships with each. We structured operative synergies with the European Union's Global Gateway and the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment of the G7. We built new financial instruments with the African Bank for Development and the World Bank to allow for a flow of public and private resources. We devised innovative solutions such as the Apulia Food Security Initiative to strengthen food production and food security, and the Energy for Growth in Africa to support the production and distribution of clean energy. We have decided to support strategic projects for Africa, such as the Lobito Corridor. We have done all of this without ever ceasing to involve and exchange inputs with our African interlocutors. We intend not to impose, but to share, and together choose priorities, sectors of intervention, areas of action. Where we could be an added value, we offered our perspective and our cooperation with projects that are already giving results. In Algeria, we will render fertile 36,000 hectares of desert land for crop cultivation and build a local facility for processing and production. In Kenya, with the development of a biofuel plant that will be completed by the end of 2025 and will sustain up to 200,000 small farming enterprises. In Ethiopia, with a large environmental recovery plan on the area of the Boy Lake in the west of the country. Because I want to reiterate this once again, our objective before tens of thousands of people who face desperate journeys to enter Europe illegally is to first guarantee their right to not have to emigrate and to not have to cut their ties with their homeland simply because they have no other choice. It's a desperation on which reckless criminal organizations that are more and more powerful and ramified profit. I proposed a year ago from this podium to declare a global war against human traffickers, and I am happy to see that that appeal did not fall on deaf ears. First, in the G7, we found an agreement that gave life to an agreement, coordination to dismantle criminal networks. The United Nations must do more, however, because these criminal organizations are reproposing themselves under other forms. For example, slavery, understood as the commercialization of the human being, that this assembly and other times had a fundamental role in ridding the world of this definitively. We are not turning back to the past. Defeating the slave trade of the third millennium is possible. We can do so if we join forces with greater cooperation and joint initiatives among our police forces, intelligence services, judicial authorities in adopting the formula, follow the money. This was an intuition of great Italian judges, Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, that became a model even at the international level to combat criminal organizations. It is a method that Italy intends to use to strengthen its cooperation with Latin America, because there's a common denominator that ties organizations that profit on human trafficking in Africa and those who manage narco trafficking in Latin America, or the abominable act of abducting children to render them sex slaves of rich men, depriving them of their present and their future. In America Latina, where unfortunately, as it happens in other regions of the world, its legitimate aspirations of freedom and democracy, that of tens of millions of people, continue to be unfulfilled. Thinking in particular of the Venezuelan people, to which we give our full solidarity and support. The international community cannot just stand there and watch, as already after 2 months since the elections on the 28th of July, the election results have not been recognized. And at the same time, there's been a brutal repression, the death of tens of protesters, the arbitrary arrest of thousands of political opponents, the incrimination and banishing of the presidential candidate of the opposition. It is our duty to raise our voices. Dear friends, in 2025, we will be celebrating the 80th anniversary of the Charter of the United Nations, the charter that enshrines the principles and values that at this time have been put into question by none other than a permanent member of the Security Council, but whose defense we will not back down, because these are principles and values that are made for all as a guarantee, especially countries that are less equipped to defend themselves. No one is above the law, but this is needed even more to defend the more vulnerable. And for this reason, We cannot turn our backs in front of the right of Ukraine to defend its borders, its sovereignty, its freedom. As we affirm the right of the State of Israel to defend itself from external attacks like the attack of the 7th of October. At the same time, we ask Israel to respect international law, protecting civilian populations. It too a victim of Hamas and of its destructive choices. And following the same reasoning, we believe obviously in the right of the Palestinian people to their own state. But for this to happen, we need Palestinians to entrust it to a leadership that is inspired by dialogue, by stabilizing the Middle East, and autonomy. The Abraham Accords have shown the possibility of an advantageous coexistence and cooperation on the basis of mutual recognition. If this is the basis on which we all have to work, and it is, today the imperative is to reach without further delay a ceasefire in Gaza and the immediate release of Israeli hostages. We cannot witness any longer tragedies like we've seen in these days in the south and east of Lebanon with the involvement of helpless civilians, many of which children. That said, the anniversary next year gives us a historic opportunity to be finally aware, whether we like it or not, that the problems that we have involve all of us. And we must be able to question ourselves with humility and awareness. And this imposes also a serious reflection about multilateralism, on the capacity of international organizations to be up to task in this era to the challenges that we are facing. I'm talking about the United Nations and its capacity to reform, starting with what is useful and necessary and not from what is easier. Italy firmly believes that whatever reform of the architecture and the functioning of the United Nations, starting with the Security Council, cannot go without considering the principles of equality, democracy, and representativeness. It would be a mistake to create new hierarchies with new permanent seats. We are open to discuss the reform without prejudice, but we want a reform that serves to represent everyone better, not to represent better only a few. Colleagues, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it's a difficult time, the one we have been called in to govern our nations. And around this, we see all changes. Everything is put into question. The very few certainties we thought we had are no longer the same. Destiny is challenging us, but in the end, it is doing that to put us to the test. In the storm, we can show to be up to task in the work that we have to do. We can show citizens that we govern and show our children. We can show ourselves, probably ourselves even more importantly, as a great Italian patriot, Carlo Pisacane, the protagonist of the Risorgimento, said, compensation, every compensation will be found at the bottom of my conscience. We have to face problems instead of push them and kicking the can down, to look at what is important, what is useful. This is our duty. It's hard. It's a hard task, but it's necessary. And Italy, as always, is ready to do its part. Thank you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Council of Ministers of the Republic of Italy.